My name's Martin. I'm the tutor for the Blue Group on the course. In a minute, I'm going to introduce Claire, but just a little bit about how the webinar will work. So if you want to ask a question at any time, type it into the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner there. I will gather our questions, and every now and again I'll send them over to Claire, and she will do her best to answer them, because obviously some of them are going to be very similar, so there's no point in answering questions that are the same. So I'll kind of facilitate that and pass on the most relevant ones to Claire. If you look at the box above, so the one that says attendee list at the top, the middle box on the left-hand side, you'll see a smiley face icon. If you click on that, there are a number of little actions that you can take. So if Claire makes a point that you agree with or disagree with, you can say that. You can raise your hand to when you want to type in a question, and you can also ask to speak louder or speak softer. So that's that. At a couple of points during the webinar, I will organize an online poll about some of the things we're discussing, which you can respond to, and we will get real-time information on that. So that's, I think the whole thing is pretty straightforward. It looks like everybody is working now. So just a quick word about Claire, and then we'll get into the webinar. Claire Provost is a journalist on The Guardian, on the global development section. She's got a huge amount of experience reporting from lots of different countries all over the world, including Egypt, Tunisia, Senegal, India. And oh, sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background there. I think he wants to join in as well. She has, this is the second webinar that she's done for this course. The first one last year stimulated a huge amount of discussion. So because we're running a little bit late, I'm not going to say any more about Claire at this stage and hand over to her. Claire.
You have this. Okay, great. Hi. Can everybody see and hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Terrific. So hello from London. So as Martin very kindly said, so my name is Claire Provost, and I'm a journalist at The Guardian, the newspaper, and I work specifically on global development. So I work on the global development section. And just very quickly, maybe before we start, I was hoping maybe I could get a little introduction from you. Can we try this function where we raise hands? And can you raise your hand if you are currently a working journalist? Okay, great. And can you put down your hand? Let's try to put down the hands now. Okay, and now can you raise your hand if you work primarily online? If you're a working journalist and you work primarily online, or if you are a student journalist and you expect to be working primarily online? Okay, great. Terrific. Okay, that's just really helpful little context for me. So just to start with a really quick introduction about who I am and what I do. So as I said before, I've been working on the global development section of The Guardian since September 2010, when we launched with three very broad ambitions. The first one, to respond to what some saw as the failures of a sort of disaster-driven news agenda, where it's very difficult to get stories about places that are far away onto front pages unless there's a natural disaster, a crisis, a conflict, or a very high-level scandal. So that was one ambition, to try to balance that and to add to bring other issues to the fore. Second, to lift the lid on what we thought were really, really important, but often very technocratic, very exclusive debates held by experts behind closed doors, debates about where global funding goes, debates about international policy, and everything from that international level down to very similar debates at the national level that are all too often held behind closed doors and seen as too technical for everyday people. So we also wanted to lift the lid on that on those conversations and help people get to grips with what was going on. Then the third broad ambition, to bring very classic, traditional journalistic scrutiny to bear on issues that too often go underneath the radar, and help our readers really understand what is going on in the world today in terms of all the vast, dramatic changes and shifts and balances of power, what the rise of emerging economies means for the most vulnerable, all of those sorts of issues, to sort of bring real traditional journalistic skills to bear on issues that are often neglected. Right. So I'm in a, in the context of development journalism, I'm in a really privileged position in that I work on global development issues 100% of my time. That being said, I work on global development issues in a big, very mainstream newspaper. And so I and my colleagues, we still have to make the case for why these stories and these issues are important to cover internally in the broader context. So I think that's kind of a good jumping off point to start talking about, the very basic question of why cover these issues, why cover global development. And there are many ways you can answer that question. Why would you cover global development? But I'm going to start it off by giving you what I think are 3 pretty good, successful answers in a newsroom. So if a news editor asks you, why would you cover this? Here are 3 types of answers that I have found successful. So the first one, so this here is, these are advertisements that we made, the Global Development site made last year to sort of advertise the site, right? But what they sort of represent is, they're both sort of depictions of, this idea of the world's changing really rapidly. So one of them shows, asks, what if London were growing as fast as Lagos, drawing attention to population growth. The second one asks, what if Paris had as many cars as Mumbai, drawing attention to the really rapid industrialization in India. And what these images are trying to suggest to people is, the world is changing extremely quickly right now, and it's changing extremely quickly in areas that Western news media maybe hasn't been as good at covering in the past. And that if you're not looking at these stories, if you're not reading these stories, if you're not looking for these issues, you're going to miss a big part of the global picture of what's going on in the world today. So I think that's one good way of answering the question of why cover global development. Basically, if you don't cover it, we writers and readers are missing out on a big story, on probably the big story of the world today, how the world is changing and what that means for people who live in these different countries. A second sort of type of answer, I think, is, so this slide shows, this is a picture from a very small village in Ethiopia where midwives have been trained to do quite sophisticated, or would have been thought as quite sophisticated medical techniques, such as injecting contraceptive implants under the skin. And a few NGOs last year did a study where they estimated that were the UK to adopt a similar strategy and do the same thing, that the National Health Service here, the Public Health Service in the UK, would save billions of pounds, would be able to reach many, many, many more women. And so this is an example of where groups have found something in a developing country that maybe hasn't gotten the coverage it deserves, and something that communities in the UK and doctors in the UK can and maybe should learn from. So that's another sort of type of answer, is that there are lots of things going on all over the world that if we don't pay attention, we might miss out on things that are also really important and that we can learn from in our own countries. And then the third, this is the third, what I think is a third good answer to this question, why cover global development issues. This is a picture, this is a map of the world in 2002. Oh, okay. That's it. Okay. This is a map of the world in 2002 that I just did really quickly, showing the concentration of internet users per 100 people. So as you can see, there's a lot of data issues here too. Some countries are just blank because there's no data. But basically, you know, the world's internet users in 2002, 10 years ago, were basically concentrated in North America and Western Europe, to some extent a little bit in East Asia. This is the world today. So clearly there's still areas where either there is very bad data or there is actually very low internet connectivity, but the world is completely different. And if you work on online news, that means that you have a potential readership and possibly an actual readership that is very different today than it was 10 years ago. And that means that, you know, journalists need to start thinking about telling other types of stories. And so there are global development issues are also not just subjects for stories to write for Western audiences, but for a very global audience. So I think thinking about, so this is a good answer, I think, to the question, why cover global development issues? Most of the world lives in developing countries. It's probably a good answer. And most of the world is now online, and I work on online news. That's probably a good answer. But also, I think this slide sort of also points to the fact that we need to think about how we tell global development stories and be very cognizant about the fact that the audience is very likely to be very global today. And so, you know, if you're sitting in, I don't know, if you're a Canadian journalist, I'm from Canada, if you're a Canadian journalist, you can't just think about telling stories to Canadians. It's important to be able to reach out to people in your domestic audience, but you have to if you're working on online news in particular, be very cognizant of the fact that someone from anywhere in the world might read what you write. Yeah. So I mean, I think these two slides, let me just flip between them one more time. 10 years ago and today, I think this shows really clearly, like, it's a really good answer to why cover global development issues, but also I think shows that, you know, if you are a journalist, particularly a young journalist who is thinking about what their career paths and what they might want to focus on in the future, focusing on international affairs and the issues that affect people in the majority, around the world, you're likely to be a step ahead in many ways, and because this map will also change in the next 100 years. And our audiences will get increasingly global. And so it's one of the things that we think about at The Guardian all the time is how to write stories that are interesting and relevant to our UK audience at the same time as reaching out into all of the new and growing and potential future online audiences. So that's really quickly why I think three answers that, at least three types of answers that have been successful for me when I've had to explain to editors and other colleagues why it's important to look at these issues. Now, so that's maybe why it's good to look at. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, we have a poll. I hadn't realized. Sorry. Okay, I see in the chat the conversation about languages. I mean, I definitely get the point that if you're writing in a language that is spoken by a small number of people, that your audience might be different. However, when I do, I mean, this is from personal experience at least, when I do my research for my stories, I do research in 12 different languages, many of which are not my first or second or third language, and so online tools like even like Google Translate mean that there may be still a barrier to people accessing what you write, but it's definitely, I think, falling. Also, examples are the picture from Ethiopia, for example. So I went to Ethiopia last November. And I wrote in English, and a lot of people who, and there are people in Ethiopia who don't speak English, but I found myself getting emails in Amharic, in Oromo, in other languages. So, of course, language is still a barrier, but I would still not underestimate the power of the internet to actually spread information and whatnot. Right. So, is it okay if I jump ahead, or do you want to okay, so I just wanted to move on quickly to just run through. Now we've talked a little bit about why you might want to cover global development issues. What is a global development issue? So we get on the global development site at The Guardian, as you would imagine, we get a lot of emails often asking what exactly is a global development story, and if I want to pitch this, but I don't know if it is a global development story. And different people have different opinions on what kind of stories should qualify as a global development story. I don't think that there is really a right or a wrong answer here, and it is very much up to interpretation, and in many ways development is a very, very contested term and a very political term. But just going to show you this. So the top 8 here, these are little icons for the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And I'm not trying to say that these, summarize what development is in any way. But there's 2 interesting things on this slide. One, these topics, while I don't want to say that they're conclusive or all-inclusive, are good things to keep an eye on. And then the second thing is I wanted to show you is, so the first 8 here are the Millennium Development Goals set in 2000, very sort of classic issues: education, hunger, poverty, gender equality. Now the bullet points underneath is a long list of proposed topics for the Sustainable Development Goals. The new set of global goals that are set to replace the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. Now this list is really long and it will be whittled down, but I think it's interesting to see that, in comparison to the really classic topics of the Millennium Development Goals, the poverty, education, hunger, gender equality, child mortality, etc., this new long list has a number of very different things on it. For example, human rights and the right to development, which were not in the MDGs to begin with. Promoting equality, social equality, conflict prevention, peace building. I mean, a number of these issues were things that no one really wanted to touch at the time of the framing of the Millennium Development Goals. So this, I think, shows a few things. So one, while no list can conclusively summarize what global development is, it is useful as a journalist to keep an eye, A, on the topics that are up for discussion, and B, on the debates themselves. Because, for example, this bottom list, this long list, will be whittled down in the next few months. It will be shortened. Some things will fall off of it, and the politics around what will fall off it and what will stay on it, those are really interesting stories, and really, really undercovered. So, for example, it surprises me that this isn't better covered, because, for example, the climate change talks are really, really well covered. the discussions about what will be the new Millennium Development Goals are basically like global development's climate talks. And the rumor right now is that next week, equality will be dropped off the list of future goals. If that happens, I mean, I think that's a really interesting story and an important story, and one that is not being covered. And so I guess the point there was keep an eye on the topics, because they might give you good ideas for stories or for contacts, for statistics, etc. But also the debates about what gets included, what doesn't, I think really deserve more journalistic scrutiny. Okay, so then, Martin, I don't know if you wanted to if we should do a few questions now, because my next section is more going into walking through practical examples and tips about both writing on global development issues from the desk, from your own country, and then talking about writing about these issues from overseas. So I don't know if it might make sense to do a few questions first.
Okay, can you hear me, Martin?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I just sent you two questions which came up. So they are essentially, do you have any particular codes of conduct or ethical codes that you use or that you adhere to in your reporting? And the second question is, do you believe that being a foreigner is an advantage or a disadvantage when you're covering stories overseas?
Those are interesting questions. So on the code of conduct one, or ethics, I mean, there are broad codes of conduct and ethical codes that all journalists in the UK would follow, and would get ethics training on, and so that, I mean, that only kind of partly answers the question, because I assume the question is a bit more, are there particular codes of conduct or ethical codes to follow on global development issues? And I mean, maybe I should have a think about this, but I don't know if there are many. I mean, there are a sort of core set of principles that I follow really, really rigorously. Particularly things like, you know, I have done a number of stories where I've reported on quite traumatic events, and stories where there have been quite difficult situations for people to talk about. And I mean, I guess my number one rule there, and one of my number one rules, period, in writing about global development issues, is to do everything in my power to ensure that A, the person I speak to knows exactly the implications of speaking to me, because, you know, even though I showed these maps of internet access around the world, you know, there are obviously communities which where people will not have ever been on the internet, will not know what the internet is, and it can be really difficult to really communicate effectively to them that the implications of speaking to me. But you know, so I think that's one thing, if I've communicated that properly, to do everything in your power to ensure that that the person you're speaking to understands what it means to speak to a journalist who writes online, that an article online will be there forever, that a photo online will be there forever, and anyone in the world could find it. I mean, I think that's one broad issue that is, you know, a core rule. And then the second one is that, especially when you're talking about traumatic events or traumatic experiences, my rule on that is to do, again, everything in my power to ensure that the conversation that I have and the process of news gathering around that does not add to the trauma that the person's experienced. And there are ways to talk through traumatic experiences that actually help empower people and help people feel empowered. But so, I mean, I don't know if that completely answers the question, but there will be, there are numbers of different journalistic codes of conduct around. But I mean, I think there are some sort of broad rules like that, sort of more in terms of the practice of journalism that maybe are a bit more particular to the issues that you might be looking at in global development, and that, I mean, I think require, a decent amount of self-reflection and understanding, if that helps. Then the second one about being a foreigner, whether or not it's an advantage or a disadvantage, I completely depends on the context, for me at least. I've had experiences where being a foreigner has made it, I mean, not just being a foreigner, but admittedly I work for a really large news organization, so I have had experiences where being a foreigner working for a very large news organization has made it much easier for me to get access to, whether it's access to documents or access to meetings or access to high-level interviews. But then at the same time, I've had, for very similar reasons, I guess, definitely had challenges because, especially if, going to and working in communities where where foreigners do not often come through, and where maybe people don't speak multiple languages, and also where maybe standards and expectations of journalists are a little bit different. So it really depends, and I think I think one of the reasons I think it's a really good question is because especially if you're going overseas, thinking that through before you go will absolutely help you when you're there to see challenges before they arise, so you can deal with them before they happen, and then also help you sort of develop a strategy to navigate those issues, whether it is how to use the fact that you're not from the country to try to get a more interesting interview by saying I'm only here for a week, and if you don't talk to me now, you never that kind of thing, or the opposite of trying to strategize how to responsibly and successfully go into a community that has never met someone from the UK or the Canada or Poland or wherever you're from, and to think that through in advance is absolutely a good strategy. Okay, sorry, I lost the slides for a second. So a number of people are asking about using photo and video in reporting. I mean, I wonder what you, what exactly do you, I mean, I wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit now and then a little bit later. But what exactly is the question about using photo and video in reporting?
Hi, Claire, it's Martin. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Yeah, I think a number of people were asking whether using photo and video can kind of take the place of using text, or the role of multimedia reporting rather than just sticking to text.
Okay, great. Now, we can come back to this later because I have a few examples sort of specifically on this, but very, very broadly, obviously it depends on the story that you want to work on. So, I do a lot of sort of multimedia interactive journalistic projects, partly because of exactly that point, that using different tools, and especially the number of different tools that we have now with online digital journalism, does make it easier sometimes to get into really complex topics, and can break down sort of the barrier to entry for someone who has never read a story about child mortality before, never really thought that they were interested in gender equality. Using different media and different tools can make stories that either sound a bit too serious, more engaging, or a bit too technical, more accessible, or a bit too far away, a bit closer and easier to relate to. So I absolutely agree with that. At the same time, I think it completely depends on the story, and not just in global development journalism, but across the board right now. I think we're seeing a lot of very, what's the polite way to say it? A lot of sort of fashionable uses of multimedia where they really don't, where text would just be just as good or better. So you don't want to necessarily use video or photo for the sake of using video or photo. What I think essentially, what you need is think, what is the best way to tell my story to the audience I want to tell it, and sometimes the best way to do that is in simple text. Sometimes the best way to do that is in 2 photos. Sometimes it's 1 photo. But I'm a very firm believer that things should be story-led. But I have a few examples of some, I think, good story-led interactive and multimedia journalism about global development, which we can look at later. Great. So is it okay if should I move on, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Then
okay.
we'll take some more questions later.
Okay. Yeah. Just Martin, just jump in when you think it's an appropriate time as well.
Okay.
Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit. So I sort of divided the next section into 2. One, talking a little bit about sort of things that I've learned over the last 4 years in terms of how to report about global development issues from your home country. So I spend, I do travel quite a bit for my work, but I am based on, primarily in London. And so, it is a good question. How do you cover issues about developing countries from London? And how do you do that responsibly and accurately and professionally? And so, my personal strategy, and it doesn't have to be everyone's, but I have focused much more on sort of investigative projects and investigative projects around public spending. So aid finance, other forms of development finance, trade, quite, I guess, quite serious and technical subjects in many ways. But also subjects where there are lots of really, really good stories and where it's absolutely, I think, acceptable to work on from your home country. So, without wanting to focus too much on aid, for example, we all know that there have been dozens, hundreds, thousands of polemical pieces written about aid over the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Stories that, even if they're not explicitly comment pieces, are basically aid is good or aid is bad. But beyond that, there's been very little really good investigative journalism done on aid, and it's a brilliant topic and absolutely deserving of more scrutiny. So I do a lot of aid-related investigations for all of those reasons. So this is one example on the screen. This is from a few years ago now. But I did this from London. It was about, I wanted to know, the US has a very unusual in many ways policy around its food aid program. So the US is the world's largest food aid donor, but it requires that the majority of its food aid, it requires by law that the majority of its food aid is actual grain grown in the US, packaged in the US, and then shipped on US ships. And the narrative around this in the US is that this is a great program because through this program, Americans help poor people in developing countries at the same time as helping poor farmers in America sell their grain to, so sort of framed as a sort of win-win. And it's very much framed in that narrative of the food that is grown and then shipped is coming from poor American farmers. So I was really suspicious of this narrative, and so I spent a lot of time going through every single shipment order for a little bit more than a fiscal year. And so I went through this. I printed off thousands and thousands. I shouldn't have printed it, but I printed off thousands of shipment orders And then I went through them and I coded them and I put them all into a database one by one, to see on total who were the major suppliers of the food aid. And the result was sort of along the lines of what I was expecting, which is that the main suppliers of the program were not actually poor American farmers, but instead were the really, really big American grain traders, Cargill, Bunge, ADM, those big companies. And so off the back of this, there were a number of very serious accusations made against the US government off the back of this research that this program was nothing more than corporate welfare. The story did spark a bit of a debate about who exactly is benefiting from the US food aid program, why exactly the program isn't transparent and people didn't know this before, that kind of thing. So that's just one example, but that's the kind of thing that you takes time and isn't necessarily glamorous, but is, I think, quite an important topic and something that is absolutely responsible to do from your country. So, and then on this slide, you can't really see it very well, but we made an interactive to help you, to let people explore the data that we had compiled so that they could look through which companies were selling what to where was it going, all of that for the first time. So that was cool. This is another example, also something that seems a bit technical. This was looking at an arm of the UK aid program, looking at where its money was going. And this was, right after the Prime Minister David Cameron made a number of really, really high-profile pledges that he would, help, or he would support a clampdown on tax havens and tax avoidance, partly because of the impact of tax avoidance on developing countries. We wanted to see, to what extent different bits of the British government were also using tax havens. And so I spent quite a bit of time. I mean, actually, this story is a bit different because I used access to information laws to get this information. So I went through the Freedom of Information process to get really, really detailed data from the CDC, this arm of the British aid program, to see where exactly its money was going. And the result was that half of its investments in developing countries were going through tax havens. So that was also a good, that's a good story and an important story, and one that is absolutely a global development story with global development implications, but was done from London, can be done from London responsibly, etc. And actually London is the appropriate place to maybe do that story. So and there will be things like that in all of your countries as well. Really, good and really important stories that probably no one is looking at, and that, which is good for you in one way because you can maybe create a little niche for yourself. But it also means it's really important that someone actually does look into these things. A year ago, I and many other people thought that stories about aid were going to sort of go down in the history books because global aid levels were falling. But in April this year, the new figures from last year show that actually global aid flows are on their way back up, and so I think that's a big call for more scrutiny right there. Great. So that's, hang on one second, let me see if I have anything else I want to raise. Yeah, but okay, so those are two examples of things that you might think, I don't know how interested you are in that kind of sort of forensic investigative work on, but if you are interested in that, there is a lot to be done on global development issues. For other things, writing from the desk can be really, really challenging, but it doesn't mean you can't pursue other stories from where you're based. And I have a few sort of, maybe general little bits of advice or things that I've tried to learn and keep in mind when I work on other stories. And so, you know, one of my major priorities. Oh, sorry. One of my major priorities when I work on other stories is to, you know, I'm constantly trying to develop collaborations with and contacts with journalists in developing countries. So I go to conferences and events, and I sign up to email lists and all of that to try to, you know, meet as many really good journalists from developing countries. And I read a lot of news from my focus historically has been sub-Saharan Africa, Central and East Africa. And so I've spent a lot of time, you know, also like reading the local news and getting to know a few reporters who I really like their work, and try to make contact with them, partly because you know, having a network of contacts in developing countries is likely going to be a priority for you if you want to do any reporting on global development issues, but then also because I quite like to write things in conjunction with people. I like to co-write things, and so if I am based in London and I can do a sort of London end of the story, and someone in another country can go do their end of the story, and we can put something together like that collaboratively. That's one approach that I really like. But then also, you know, there are other cases where, this is an example of, this is also a few years ago, where there were a number of like really small reports coming out in the local press about really large scale, very violent land acquisitions in Sierra Leone. And I wanted to look into this, but I was based in London, so I mean, how do you do that, really, right? But there were a number of British and French companies involved, and so I started doing the research to go through their company accounts and to try to understand what their company strategies are and what they were buying and who they were and all of that. At the same time, you know, I made contact with a freelancer who was based in Freetown. And then we started working on a story together. And she went to a local community meeting to talk to people who were resisting these land deals, at the same time as I was doing maybe slightly more forensic accounting, you know, less human-centered work, looking through the company's accounts on this side. But that worked really well. And so that, I mean, that's a strategy that I often try to do, is work with people. If not work with them, then at least, you know, try to develop contacts so I can bounce things off of people and see if they make sense to people who are living in the country. Because you don't want to get into a situation where you're assuming things. Absolutely not. Yeah, but then the other thing I mean, those are general sort of little bits of advice. You know, to develop contacts, to spend time reading the local news in the countries that you're interested in, so you get to know the local reporters well. And then, you know, then two other little bits of advice I would give is one that you know, you shouldn't be afraid to say no to doing a story either if you don't think it's appropriate, or you don't think that you have enough access to people on the ground or raw material or context. There's no shame in saying no to doing a story. So I mean, that should always be an option. Or saying I don't want to do this now, but I want to go to the place and look at it more in depth in the future. And if you do, and then another bit of advice, if you do write something, if you do work on something from your country, from the desk, and you know, sometimes NGOs and academics, civil society organizations can be really, really helpful to help connect you with people in local communities, or get you information that you could only get if you were there in person. Though I would say 100 times over to be extremely cautious of relying on any one NGO or civil society group or academic institution for your story and information and contacts, because even for lots of reasons, but it's always, you know, I would maybe say that as firm rule not to rely on any one organization. So Martin, you have some more questions, you said.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, good. Okay, so yes, a number of people have asked. I mean, it's a question that we all ask ourselves as journalists, I suppose. How do you find your stories? Where do you go to for the sources of your stories?
I mean, sorry, I'm hesitating just because I'm thinking because in the last few years I've just become very obsessed with a few topics, and so stories just keep coming to me, and I spend a lot of journalists are quite obsessive, and so so I spend a lot of time reading about the same thing, going to conferences, going to meetings, going to networking with people, trying to learn, trying to hear, get the gossip, hear as much as I can about what's going on, and so I haven't had sat at a blank piece of paper and not known where to go in a while, though. And so I mean on that, so a lot of my stories are not necessarily directly follow-ups, but are on a similar theme. So they just keep coming. But I mean, in the past, when I didn't, because right now, for example, I have a long list of things I would love to work on. I just never have time to do them. In the past, I spent a lot of time, as I said before, making contacts and connecting with networks and trying to connect with the most grassroots networks to try to understand what the very local issues were. I guess it's difficult unless you have a particular area of interest. If you were interested in health, global health, for example, and wanted to find what were the good stories in global health, then I would say that there are like 4 or 5 really good mailing lists that I would sign up to. There are a few meetings every year that you would absolutely want to try to go to, and if you can't go to them, then watch the webcasts of that kind of thing, and then just get the more plugged in you are to these networks, I think stories will partly come to you. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that helps.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And a couple of
I don't know what would you say to
that? Yes. Well, I mean, everywhere and anywhere is the answer. But I think you're absolutely right. If you get a name for specializing in a particular area, then you'll find that people come to you. Because if you're well known for reporting on a particular issue or a particular area, then you'll find that people come to you because they know that you'll cover it seriously or whatever. So I think the longer you're in this game, the more people kind of seek you out rather than the other way around, I think.
Yeah.
A couple of other points that people have made is about following up after the story. So how much following up do you do once a story has been published? Do you feel a kind of a responsibility to keep in touch with the people who were characters in the story?
I mean, I on a personal level, I do feel a responsibility to keep in touch with people. That doesn't mean that people always want to keep in touch with you. Not because they necessarily have anything, against you, but people have other things going on in their lives and don't necessarily want to spend their entire life calling a journalist and giving them updates on their life. But I spend a lot of time following up on my stories. So, but not everyone does that, and you don't need to do that. What I would say is that if you, I think especially if it is if you are working on a story that is where there are very strong human stories in it and it's very character led, and where it does involve really close collaboration with people or very close conversations with people, particularly in developing countries. where you might not go back, you might not go back for 6 months, you might not go back for a year, etc. I think it is really, really important to be really upfront with the people that you're talking to about the likelihood of you coming back, or when you might come back, or and your ability to follow up the story. So if it is something like, for example, this Sierra Leone story, where this is an ongoing story, and so we have done follow-ups to this, but what we've had to do is to think quite strategically about what are the next important moments for us to step in and do an update. So I would say, yeah, I think it is important to follow up stories, and I think there are lots of really good follow-up stories. So if you don't follow things up, you might be missing out on things. That being said, it can be really difficult. So I would, a key rule for me would be just to be really upfront and honest with the people who are involved, about what it is you will do, what it is you can do, realistically. And also in some countries people might not, where there isn't necessarily a very vibrant independent media for whatever reason, people might not necessarily understand exactly what your role is, and it has happened to me in the past where I've had to be very clear with people on explaining that I do not work for Oxfam, or I don't work for an NGO. I'm not collecting your stories so that I can give them to supporters, so they will make a charity donation. It's a different thing, and so I think being upfront and being very honest and very human with people is really important.
Okay, one more quick question, which is a very sort of specific one. How much time did the story on US food aid require? And do you kind of have a set number of stories that you have to publish each month, or can you spend more time on one, on less on others? How does it work?
Yeah, it's like that. It's more time, it depends on the story. So if it's a good story, and my editors, a lot of editors, they like the words like exclusive, never been done before, most up to date, new exciting revelations, that kind of thing. And so sometimes when there are stories like the US food aid story did take time. So it took probably about 4 weeks, and it was me and a few other people working on very different aspects of the project. And so that definitely did take time, but the promise was, you're going to get something no one else has ever done before, and it's going to be a great story and all of that kind of thing. And so, but realistically, you have to pick your battles and not try to get, the same. I mean, at least I have to pick my battles and not try to get that amount of time to work on every story, because it's not possible. Okay,
great. So I'll let you crack on, and I'll collect some more questions towards the end.
Great. Okay. So I want to talk quickly about writing from overseas, and some sort of tips and bits of advice that people have given to me and that I've given to other people, and I've internalized, and in case they're useful. So I've kind of grouped in my head the challenges that you might encounter when you're reporting from overseas into different categories depending on how you travel. Because I think that traveling independently, either on your own initiative as a freelancer or on behalf of a news organization, is very different than going overseas and reporting on a trip with an NGO or a civil society organization, or going on a UN trip with the UN or something like that. And I think that's also really different from going on a structured sort of overseas fellowship, of which there are many now, overseas reporting trips that are that are specifically specially funded, but are kind of in between the rest. Maybe they're funded by a foundation, a philanthropic foundation, but you're kind of going on your own initiative. So those are kind of the sort of, I think the challenges of reporting from these issues overseas depend a little bit on how you go overseas. And I want to talk quickly about going on trips that are organized by NGOs or by the UN agencies, or by foundations, because they are increasingly common. These happen all we get offers and that to go on trips with organizations, trips that organizations will pay for as well. And those raise a lot of issues. And again, I think a core rule in all of this stuff is I think to be extremely upfront and very clear. So, you know, if an organization invites you to go on a trip, I think it's really important to understand exactly why they want you to go, how exactly you're going fits into their strategy, so that you understand what they want you to do, not because you want to do it, but because you don't want to unintentionally fall into someone's media strategy or communication strategy without being aware of it. And that's important also because, you know, well, first, backing up a second, you know, some editors will not let journalists go on sponsored trips or organized trips. So, you know, if you were ever offered to go on a trip with an NGO or a UN agency, you'd want to have a very upfront conversation with an editor or with whoever you might want to publish a story with in the future, to understand their rules and understand their rules on what organizations are and aren't allowed to pay for and what you are and aren't allowed to do with them. But then sort of, I think, you know, so you want to clarify everything with your editor and then clarify everything with the NGO to understand exactly what they want to get out of it, what you might be able to get out of it, etc. I mean, I'm saying this because I don't think you should, I think it is it is possible and can be a really good idea to go on a trip with a sponsored trip with an organization, but you just need to be extremely careful about how you do it, partly because of this issue with how news organizations may or may not perceive it, but also because how your reader may or may not perceive it. So you know, some readers will understandably trust your stories less if they think you went with an organization. Or they might see you as less independent if you go with an organization, and that is understandable. And so, so you want to think through all these things and be as upfront as possible. And then, before I move on to other things, also with going with NGOs. So I'm going to give an example of a trip that I went on. Quite a disastrous trip. I'm not going to name the country or the organization I went with. But 4 years ago, I went, three and a half years, something like that. I went on an organized trip to a country to look at, I don't even want to say the issue. I went to go and look at a particular issue that was extremely topical at the time, but what was strangely kind of undercovered. So it was a good story idea, absolutely. The organization absolutely had an agenda in inviting me to go on the trip because they wanted me to look at one of their projects. And this is very common that NGOs and UN agencies will want you to go and look at something that they've done and write about something that they've done. So that was this case. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but you have to be aware of what's going on, that's all. And I went on this trip, and this is just, I think, one of the biggest, I mean, this is an important thing to keep in mind on all of these trips, but I went on this trip and I didn't speak the local language. And the trip had been entirely organized by this organization, and they told me that they would have a translator. So I get there, and it turns out that they don't have a translator. They have someone who works for the organization, who speaks English and the local language, who is going to translate for me. But they're not a professional translator. Translating is a really professional skill. So just because you speak two languages doesn't necessarily mean you should always be translating for purposes of reporting. They weren't a professional translator, and they worked for the organization that wanted me to look at something that they had done. So there are a number of conflict of interest things there as well, in terms of, you know, if they translate for a local person, does that local person trust them? Does that local person think that that they are going to likely relay their words. Is that person going to reliably relay the conversation? Sorry, I've lost my slides in the video. Oh, okay, sorry. So I mean, that was a really tricky trip for me, but it absolutely affected what I did in that I didn't do anything. I didn't write. I wrote one thing, but very different from what they were expecting, and but so as I think a note for the future. Something I've kept in mind ever since, and it's something that I think it's really important to keep in mind and not trivialize, is sort of the logistics. If you're going on a sponsored trip, to think through all of the logistics and all of the implications of going with an organization. Are you going to be traveling in their car? What will that mean? How are people going to perceive you if you show up at a school with them? You need to get your own translator. How are you going to do that? If you can't get your own translator, what is your backup option? So my backup option at the time was I recorded everything in the native language, and then I had it all professionally translated after. That's not an ideal solution, but it's very different from just relying on a staff member of an organization to reliably translate something. And then other things I just wanted to raise about, so that's sort of, a few, I think, words of caution about traveling with organizations. And then more broadly, there's some, I think, and these will sound very intuitive, I think, and very basic, but I think they bear repeating anyways. That before you travel anywhere, to make sure you understand to the best, that you feel confident that you understand to the best of your ability the politics and the context and the history of the place where you're going and the agenda of the different people that you're going to speak to. Because something that might seem like a simple story to you might actually have many layers behind it, and there might be many different things going on that you would be wise to try to understand before you go. And then there are also a number of maybe more sort of social and cultural issues to think through before you travel somewhere. And when in doubt, ask for advice. When in doubt, if you're traveling to, for example, if you're traveling to East Africa, when in doubt, I would ask, a sort of organization like the Rift Valley Institute for advice, or do as much background reading as I could on my own, at least. But yeah, so when in doubt, ask for advice. But there are a number of social and cultural issues that you might want to be aware of. For example, it's something that I've experienced in the past, definitely, is I've gone to communities in East Africa where I was even reporting on a women's related issue, but when I've gone to the community, it's just a group of men that is there to meet me, or is willing to speak to me, and there are no women and girls around, and I've had to ask, where are the women and girls? I want to speak to women about this, to some extent, you need to rely on your judgment about how to tread the line between being respectful and also, asking what you need to ask. For example, I need to speak to a woman about this. And the same applies to young people. Sometimes young people might not be sort of put up for you to speak to, and you might need to go and chase them down, go and find them, speak to them. It is definitely, something I notice and I wonder about when I read stories from some places where all of the speakers are men. I wonder how that's possible. Sometimes, especially if you read a story about maybe maternal mortality and all of the voices are men, it raises questions. That's not to say it's easy to negotiate these things sometimes. And then, I said this before, but I'll say it again because I really care about it. The general rule of, if you're speaking to anyone about anything that could potentially be traumatic, or where there maybe is a traumatic story in the background that you don't know about, but it's possible to really tread carefully and do everything in your power to ensure that your conversation is not going to add to their trauma, and will hopefully instead help empower them through sharing their story. And on this, the good point about the ethical codes of conduct. So that there's an organization called the DART Center for, I think it's research on trauma reporting, but they produce very good guides on how to do field work, either as a journalist or as a researcher, on issues surrounding trauma, and collecting lessons from previous experiences and people who've done things like this in the past. And I find those are quite useful resources. Yeah. Okay. So how are we? Sorry, Martin. Okay. I am ready if it works for you. If you have more questions.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so you have covered some of the questions. Particularly, a lot of people wanted to know kind of how far you can trust NGOs and how far you can trust them when you're working with them in the field and so on. So you've touched on that, but I think it might be interesting to, because very often NGOs on the ground are the best source for stories, or at least they're a good source for stories, but of course they have an agenda to push as well. So how do you kind of sort out what they're trying to get you as a journalist to write in their name, if you like, and kind of guard against that bias?
I mean, I don't know if there's like a magic formula to solve that problem, but the kind of things that I do is I try to, I put in a lot of time doing desk research and trying to learn as much as possible about the organization and about the specific people who I may be speaking to in the organization, and try to understand what their agenda, where they're coming from. You know, that's a nicer way of saying agenda, is sort of where they're coming from and what they're aiming for. I also do my homework in terms of I talk to other people in the country about that organization to try to understand what that organization's perception is, who their partners are, who they, all of that kind of thing, to try to understand their ecosystem. And then I also ask people directly, partly because sometimes they're not expecting that question and they give you really upfront answers. So I will ask people directly, what are you trying to push here? Why are you trying to push this? Why this and not that? I mean, that's often the better way of going about it. Maybe is why land rights in this area and not that area, maybe, or posing it like that rather than just why this. And I mean, that can help, I think.
Sure. Okay, that's great. We have another question about our fellow journalists. How does it kind of make you feel when you see fellow journalists either reporting in a very one-sided way, or even downright lying in their reports, on particularly relating to development issues? And have you ever actually had to confront a fellow journalist and take them to task for a very poor report?
I mean, it doesn't actually. It hasn't happened to me too often. There's an example that really sticks in my mind because it happened to me in that I wrote something last year, and it was the next day a version of it appeared in the Daily Mail, which is another UK newspaper, but has a very particular slant on aid. It is, I think it's fair to say, it's extremely anti-aid, and it stirs up a lot of the anti-aid debate here. And they took my story and basically copied and pasted it and changed things, and so that the slant was then very one-sided. And what was, I thought, a very sort of like just sort of nuanced feature had turned into an anti-AIDS story. That really upset me for lots of reasons. That went above me, and our editors spoke to editors. So I didn't confront anyone directly, but there was a conversation off the back of that. No, I mean, I can't say I have myself. I actually, I answer this in two ways. I confront people on a daily basis on maybe like little things. I haven't necessarily had any other big confrontations with journalists, but I mean, I do take journalists to task for what I think is inaccurate reporting, or sometimes it's not always malicious, right? So sometimes people just are not aware of other bits of information, and so I send little bits of information to journalists too, to say, look, I read your story, I think you might be interested in this. Here's a link. Maybe next time you might want to look into this as well, because it doesn't always have to be confrontational, because I mean, sometimes journalists are sort of pit against each other in a very sort of confrontational way, but that it doesn't necessarily have to be like that with everybody.
Okay. One last question for now, which comes from this question comes from Bulgaria, but I think it has universal application. Actually, is how do you think we can make global development issues interesting to domestic audiences when a lot of people are not really interested in what happens outside their own country, and that's reinforced.
Yeah. No, I mean. Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I think, a good question. And so in the beginning, I started by summarizing a few of the ways that I found it successful to sort of sell these things to editors. Selling stories to your audience might require different tactics, because you can't necessarily write at the top of every article, this is important because the world is changing, and if you don't read this story, you're going to miss out on a big story about the changing world. So I think, I mean, I don't think there's a magic formula, but I think some like very basic rules probably do apply to development journalism, as any other kind of journalism. Powerful human stories are really, really effective, and having powerful human stories from that can make a big difference and draw readers into things that they might know nothing about, care nothing about, not be interested in. A really powerful, gripping human story can still grab someone sometimes. Then again, sort of exclusive sort of new investigations, unearthing new information. I think people are sort of attracted by, finding, getting a hold of a piece of information that was never seen before and no one knew about before. So I think, I think that can also work too. And then there are also, a number of devices that journalists will use in reporting on global development issues, as in reporting on any other issue. For example, one of the stories I was going to show was this is a really big piece of work that our site did last year on looking at forced labor conditions around in Qatar, which predate the building of the World Cup. Predate the announcement of the World Cup and the building of the stadia and whatnot. But maybe not everyone was interested in forced labor issues of Nepali migrants and Indian migrants in Qatar. 5 years ago, even though it was happening 5 years ago. The fact that it had a World Cup link all of a sudden made it seem really accessible to a lot of people, because I don't watch the World Cup, but a lot of people do. A lot of people do watch the World Cup and care about sport. And so that made this issue that people might have thought was horrendous, but made something that might have seemed far away all of a sudden really touch them. And so, but that's sort of like a very traditional device of finding a very, very, very topical, very emotive hook. And so, I mean, I guess partly what I'm trying to say there is that I don't think it's always right to think of journalism about global development issues as very different from other types of journalism. There are like some very basic principles and tips and skills and stuff that sort of apply across the board, like the find a powerful human story, look for exclusives, find ways like, the World Cup or something like that to connect a story to your audience. I mean, so we might really be in need of this in journalism about development issues, but journalists across the board on working on any issue will think in these terms in many ways. So similarly, stories that we do about commodities, about coffee, about cocoa, about sugar, are really, really, really popular. There's a lot of appetite for those, regardless of whether or not it's, so if it's, there might not be a huge appetite for stories on trade rules around exports from West Africa or the African Caribbean export program or whatever it is, but there might be a lot of appetite for stories about cocoa, and telling a story about trade rules through a commodity can be a really, really successful way of doing it. So I think partly it's just about being creative and looking for those links. I don't think it's an impossible task at all, and I don't think it's one that's also exclusive to development journalism.
Sure. Someone's asking, did you, or presumably one of your team, actually go to Qatar to cover that story? Did you have reporters on the ground?
Yeah, so Pete Pattison, he went to Qatar. So he's based in Nepal, and he went to Qatar to do that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, because we started late, I guess we can go on a while, Claire. So I don't know where you want to go from here, or you want to take some more questions.
Well, maybe I'll just there are a few other things I just wanted to run through really, really quickly, and then if there are any other questions, we can do that. So just because off the back of what I was just saying about how there are skills and devices that are useful for reporters who are working on development issues as they are useful for reporters working on any other issue. I also think the sort of I think it can be wrong to think of development issues as excessively complex sometimes. I think there is a tendency sometimes to think about journalism about global development issues as excessively emotional or excessively complex or excessively far away or excessively technical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it can be a bit dangerous to fall into that trap sometimes, because for example, where I sit at the Guardian, I don't sit far from the business desk, for example, who are writing about things like quantitative easing all day, and subprime mortgages and very, very complex stuff. But they find ways to do it, to write about those issues in ways that are accessible and interesting and easy to digest for ordinary people. So if they can write about quantitative easing, we should be able to write about aid in ways that are accessible. And likewise, if our health desk is able to write about a really, really, really complex but very important new pharmaceutical development, we should be able to write similar stories about technology in development. So I guess that was sort of my last concluding point, was that while I think there are some things that you need to think through specifically in terms of working on journalism and development issues, I would really, really try to avoid sort of pigeonholing it or putting it in a corner like it is different from any other type of journalism. And I think some of the best development journalism is that really applies the absolute best of really traditional narrative and creative and human-led reporting techniques to these issues that are undercovered. yeah, I think that's sort of my basic point, my last point. So yeah, if there were any other questions, I would be absolutely happy to.
Yeah, we have one more here, which I think is actually quite something that a number of us will recognise. That somebody is asking, do you see yourself purely as a reporter? In other words, are you simply there to report on events, or do you believe that in doing so you're actually helping to create a kind of, or bring about a better world or to change things for the better? I mean, do you have a personal drive to want to change things for the better, or are you simply there as an observer?
I mean, so because of, this is a personal answer on a personal level. A lot of the work that I do, the sort of investigative work looking at aid flows, that kind of thing, looking at development policy and its impacts on the ground, that kind of thing. I mean, I would call that in many ways very sort of traditional watchdog journalism, sort of a holding the powerful to the account, feet to the fire, that kind of thing, which is a little bit more than just a passive observer. But I mean, that's a, so I because I work on slightly more investigative stuff, it isn't just sort of daily reporting and observing. I am actively trying to dig things up and hold those in power to account for what they have committed to or what they haven't committed to. But that's a personal thing.
Okay, that's great. And I guess sort of leading on from that, really, somebody asks that since the SDGs are all about self-empowerment, do you think that we should be encouraging more in the way of kind of participatory storytelling, participatory video, people telling their own stories rather than having to rely on journalists to do it for them?
I mean, I think all of that is really, really interesting. I don't think we should be focusing more on helping people tell their own stories because of the SDGs. I think we should be doing it anyways. I don't think we need international framework or international agreement or whatever to justify that. I think the fact that A, it's really important, B, we now have tools that make it much, much, much easier to either crowdsource information or get people to upload their own stories. I think there's the huge amount of opportunity there, and organizations like the Guardians are only starting to tap into this and experiment with it. But I think anyone who's interested in really exploring that area and pushing the boundaries of what the new digital tools mean for citizen-led reporting and that kind of thing, it's a really interesting time for that stuff. I would say with all of that, though, that I'm a really firm believer in some of the really core sort of principles of really traditional narrative journalism, like very strong story-led work, whether it's multimedia or text, very, very strong story-led stuff, unwavering commitments to accuracy. And so, yeah, so for people who want to merge the best of traditional journalism and traditional narrative journalism with the new tools that we have to enable people to tell their own stories, I mean, that is a great project for people to work on. That is a great area and really, really promising.
Yeah, and I would guess you would agree that, of course, with this kind of approach come a whole set of questions around verification and how we judge, people's the angle that people are coming from, what their own kind of agenda might be, so on. So
absolutely. And it might be the case that that those sorts of tools and that sort of engagement with sort of readers as content creators is more appropriate for certain types of stories than other stories. It might depend on the kind of thing that you're looking at. It might not always be like video is not always the right form to do things in, or text is not. Sometimes self-generated content is not always the best way to do it either. You know, I think it probably depends on the topic and the story.
Yep. Okay, well, that I think is a good place to bring the webinar to a close, Claire. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all the participants. You know, again, fascinating as always, and a lot of issues, not all of which we've answered, but you know, sort of. Oh, here I come. I'm about to appear. There we go. Yes, some great issues. So thank you so much again. I think I'm right in saying that the whole thing has been recorded. So anybody who missed bits of it wants to go over it again can do so. But in the meantime, thanks once again, and see you on the next one.
Bye. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.